It is Friday, August 2nd. Let's talk PlayStation. Honestly, the past few weeks have been pretty slow when it came to PlayStation news. However, this week, there's a lot going on. So we have to get through this in a somewhat reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, I'll just take too long. You know how I get sometimes. But we'll go to our first one, the PlayStation Plus Instant Game Collection Reminder. So we're going away from Horizon Chase Turbo and Detroit Become Human because August 6th, we are moving on to Wipeout, the Omega Collection, and Sniper Elite 4. Much better month, I feel. I think this is something that's pretty reasonable, and most people should be happy with. You're getting a PlayStation exclusive. It's got a VR mode, so that pleases VR owners. You've got Sniper Elite 4, which reviewed well, so I think this is certainly a good month for sure. Should please many people. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about the PlayStation China Joy Conference, and I said, don't expect anything crazy, but there's going to be some game announcements in there. Well, they've held that conference, and sure enough, we got a lot of game announcements. So we won't divulge anything crazy here because there's nothing to really go over, but I suggest you do look at some of these games if they're something that might pique your interest. Remember, this is an initiative that Sony does with some smaller scale Chinese developers to get them off the ground and get them developing on PlayStation. So some of these games inherently are very small, but still some very cool stuff in there for sure. Now, we'll get into some Sony Financials because, well, every single time we talk about Sony Financials every quarter, it's always the same thing, which is that, well, Sony's doing very well with PlayStation. This one's no different. However, there seems to be a running theme here, which is that PlayStation is always the driving force in Sony Corporation's overall revenue, and this is pretty much the same deal here. So if you didn't see, of course, PlayStation's operating revenue, $672 million, and PlayStation accounted for 32% overall of Sony's income. So that's a third of Sony's business coming straight from PlayStation. You've got all these other divisions that Sony, dabbles in, and very much so as a company in, and they're operating on their own, trying to stay afloat and stay in the black, but PlayStation is the breadwinner for Sony, and so that's always good news. That means Sony's going to stick with PlayStation for sure, and they've actually lowered their forecast, so they're projecting 16 million units for this entire year. They've dropped that down to 15 million. Nothing crazy, but that does tell us that we're not going to be expecting any price cuts anytime soon, or no new hardware, which, if you remember at the very start of this year, I made a pretty bold prediction, which was that we should see a price cut at some point, possibly a PS4 Super Slim. Maybe that stuff might be for next year now, seeing as how this is kind of where we're falling right now. One big interesting thing out of this, though, was that digital sales have overtaken physical sales. So PlayStation 4 software, 53% on the digital side, which is very impressive. The same time last year, it was around 40-something%. I think actually right on the dead cut of 43%, so up 10% since then. That's very impressive. A lot of people are going all digital now. I think a lot of it is a matter of, these smaller scale titles, they're only available digitally, so you can't find some of these $10, $15 games in the store. Another thing is that, well, people just prefer digital now, or the fact that there's some great sales on the PlayStation Store. And Sony, I think, has done a pretty good job when it comes to content that's 6 months to a year older, and a lot of that's also the publishers running those deals as well. But if you're a PS Plus member, if you're always jumping in on some of these sales, there's a lot of good stuff on there, and it's hard to pass up sometimes, and that's just the world we're moving towards. But it is impressive to finally see digital has overlapped that physical, which, I love my physical games, so it's slightly upsetting, but, what are you going to do? The big takeaway, though, from the earnings is that PlayStation 4 shipments and sales have reached 100 million units, a little bit over that, so very impressive stuff. We saw this coming, though. When we discussed this last quarter, I actually did a separate video detailing Sony Financials a little bit, just to get in the minutia of, where PS4 could possibly fall at the end of its life cycle. And as a quick recap, we're sitting at 100 million now. The next console up is the Wii at a little over 100 million, and then the original PlayStation at 104 million. PS4 is clearly going to keep going. It's actually reached 100 million faster than all those other machines, which is very impressive. But the Wii topped off at 100 million at about 5 years and 9 months. It took PS4 5 years and 7 months, which is impressive. It's only 2 months faster, but the thing is, we stopped at like 101. We're just hitting 100 million with PS4, and it's still got like 3 years of relevancy left on the market. So that's why in that separate video I said, PlayStation 4 has the potential to hit Game Boy numbers, which is around 118 million. After Game Boys, when you're seeing the DS and PS2 in the 150 millions. And I don't think PS4 is going to reach there, but if you look at where we're sitting right now, PS5 not till the end of 2020. Sony's still going to sell and support the hardware at least 2 years into the PS5 life cycle. We've got like 3 years left of this machine being on the market and selling millions of units. So it's still doing quite well, and I'm sure Sony's very pleased. Now, this next one is more of a PSA because I'm seeing a lot of news websites run with this as if it's actually news, which is complete nonsense, but the retailer Media Market recently posted a listing for PlayStation 5s, and you can pre-order one for the cool price of like $9,999, and I think it's in Swedish krona, and that translates to like 1,000 USD or about 850 pounds sterling, which is alarming to people, but it seems quite obvious that this is a placeholder listing, a placeholder arbitrary amount. It's not real. This is exactly akin to like when Amazon or Walmart posts a listing for a game and they put the release date as December 31st. I don't know why people still get confused by this and think, oh my god, that's the date. Oh my god, that's the price. No. I mean, Sony hasn't told us anything even remotely close to the price other than Mark Cerny saying that it will be an appealing price given the specs of the platform. And there's nothing official going on whatsoever, and surely PlayStation 5 will not cost $1,000 US. And we will talk about the story later on about the tariffs, which could potentially increase console prices, but it's not going to get up to $1,000. That's just borderline ridiculous. Moving on, let's talk about PS4 exclusive Concrete Genie. Some of you may not know this, but it's developed by a Sony first-party studio, Pixel Opus. They did Entwined previously. They're a smaller studio for sure, but this is their next game, very artistically approached, and it has a release date finally of October 8th. And it is coming out at a budget price of $29.99, which is cool. There's also a digital deluxe edition coming out for $39.99. That'll get you a bunch of goodies like a soundtrack and a digital art book, it looks like. Some pretty cool stuff. The game will have a VR mode, no HDR at launch, but that's something that they're considering, I guess. The game still looks very cool, and it's very much a game that's not for everybody, but if you kind of like what they're putting down, then you can pick it right back up. Now, next up, we got two news stories that we're just going to lump together because they're coming from the same man at the same place. During the 2019 Manchester Comic-Con, Troy Baker, the famed video game voice actor, was talking about Death Stranding and The Last of Us Part 2. So in regards to Death Stranding, he basically referred to the game as though, Kojima's trying to push the industry forward. It's not necessarily a game that's looking to sell units. It's a game that's really going to try to push the boundaries of games and what it means for telling a story and sending out a message. Just overall, this game is really going to be a big push. And this isn't unheard of from what we've heard previously about the game, which is that it has this greater meaning and greater message underlying the gameplay elements and things like that. It's going to take us by surprise, and we're still very excited about that, but keep in mind, Troy has a vested interest in the game because he's in it, and same with The Last of Us Part 2. So when he was talking about that game, he said it's the most ambitious title that Naughty Dog's ever made, and he's just shocked at how much is actually in the game and what they were able to accomplish. Now this, to a degree, bias aside, I could totally see happening because it's almost like the jump from Uncharted 3 to 4, which is that 4, was just so much more than what Uncharted previously was on PlayStation 3. And, if you've played the franchise, you're familiar with what I'm saying. Just on every spectrum of a video game, whether it's the presentation, the scope, the gameplay, they were just doing so much more in 4. And so The Last of Us is in the same scenario where it was on PlayStation 3, and it was confined to that hardware. I can see, that kind of dramatic jump from 3 to 4 with Uncharted to Last of Us on PS3 going to PlayStation 4 and seeing just how much larger this game's going to be. And also, it's a brand new Naughty Dog title, which is that what they've learned and maybe did wrong in Uncharted 4, they're going to apply to The Last of Us Part 2. And that's what I think makes me so excited about The Last of Us Part 2 more than anything else, is because it's just, God, this game's, I think, going to be really a big deal. Now, dialing a little bit back to Death Stranding, a new trailer came out for that right after LTPS last week, so forgive me that this is old, but it showcases the character Heartman, and this is very interesting because this guy is alive for 21 minutes, and then afterwards his heart stops beating, and then he's like in this grace period of 3 minutes where he's on the other side looking for his family, and he's got an EKG strapped to his chest, which revives him. He comes back for another 20 minutes, and he kind of lives this really weird lifestyle in this lavish apartment. It's just, oh god, I think this is another one of those characters where it gives us a very small scope of what the rest of this game potentially is, and so I just love seeing more and more of Death Stranding because it just looks so out there. So if you didn't see, there was a bit of a saga going on with the Order 1886 and Ready at Dawn, which is that there might be a sequel, but not really. So we'll start at the beginning here, which is that earlier in the week on the Gamerheads podcast, Sucker Punch writer Jordan Lemos was on there, and offhandedly said, oh yeah, I think they're doing a sequel when talking about the Order 1886, and he said, yeah, the last time I heard. and, you know, he's a developer in the industry. He's at a Sony first-party studio. He's got to possibly know about a sequel coming. And so this stirred the pot right away. And immediately Jordan backtracked on Twitter saying, look, I don't actually know anything. He referenced a bunch of articles that were posted about, 4, 5, 6 months ago. And these are headlines that we were discussing on Let's Talk PlayStation, which was that, they'd like to pursue a sequel, but it wasn't anything crazy, right? Like, the franchise was built with a sequel in mind, and so there were a lot of stories running about that. And he said he saw those, and that's kind of what he thought in the back of his head, that it was, common knowledge that a sequel was being worked on, or maybe it wasn't. Whatever. And that kind of ended there. But then Ready at Dawn also showed off their brand new studio. And the thing about that is that, well, typically you don't get a brand new office and studio unless you're expanding and growing and making money. And Ready at Dawn has been, well, kind of low-key the past few years. They did this weird puzzle game called Platformers or Deformers, something like that. Looks like a really dramatically small budget compared to something like The Order 1886, which has, big publisher money from Sony. But now they're doing a lot of VR stuff with Oculus. And, that's the thing, is that what's going on here? Where are they getting a lot of this capital from? Because obviously somebody's got to be funding them in some way, shape, or form. I can't imagine they're making this much money off of these, Oculus titles or Deformers. So that's kind of what's going on here, which is that, was there something to Jordan's comment on the podcast and he just had to, rescind it because he just didn't want it out there? He could get in trouble for it potentially, because that happens. If you know information and you let it out by accident, you're suddenly contacted by some PR, either at Sony or, whatever, right? You can't just say things like that arbitrarily. There's going to be consequences to what you say. Or is he being truthful, and this really is a matter of Ready at Dawn just expanding and they're working heavily with Oculus, and it's not a situation of, Sony giving the company another chance and greenlighting the Order 1886 sequel, which would be 1887. That's kind of what's going on there. I don't really know how to feel about this. I'd imagine that Sony's not going to go back to this franchise, and they're not going to go back to Ready at Dawn. And that's even including the fact that Sony's been vocal about how they want to do big second-party games, and they want to work with bigger developers and publishers and focus on exclusives. Even with that in mind, and the Order being their IP, and working with the developer again, I just don't think it's really on the cards, and I think they're pursuing other ventures with other studios. But we'll wait and see what happens. Moving on, we've got some more insight into that Sony and Microsoft deal that took place a few months back now. And so during an interview with Fortune, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said that it was pretty much a Sony-driven deal. Sony approached Microsoft, and that's how it really took place. This isn't surprising to me. If you remember, we actually had a rumor about how Sony was fielding out different companies to buy more cloud server tech and all that stuff for PlayStation Now, right? And they approached Amazon first, reportedly. Amazon's terms were probably unfavorable, and then that's when they went to Microsoft, and that's how they struck a deal. And then the deal, of course, became public because they were kind of exchanging two different services there. And that's fine. I mean, that's not uncommon. I know a lot of people are taking a microscope to this and wondering why Sony would work with the competition. How could they dare approach Microsoft first? It just seems weird. But it's just not uncommon. This happens in the tech industry quite often, where you see other companies purchasing out their tech. Again, Sony provides camera sensors to all these competing smartphone handsets. Apple buys from Samsung for their for some of the internals of iPhone. It just happens. So for it to happen in gaming, not a big deal. So this next one I found rather interesting, but Quantic Dream CEO David Cage recently told GameSpot that he wants to expand the company to the point where they're not just a developer, but also a publisher. And so they want to bring in a number of different developers, big and small, cover a lot of different genres that aren't necessarily just the storytelling genre, and just do a number of different things. And this is already on top of what they've previously said, which is that they want to start releasing games on multiple platforms. So it really looks like they want to expand in a pretty big way. So the only reason why I found this to be pretty notable is because, well, Cage also did reference their, experience with Sony, working with Sony over 12 years, and how that relationship was great. When, Quantic announced them leaving Sony and leaving exclusive games, a big discussion there was, why didn't Sony purchase Quantic Dream? And it was really a matter of, maybe Sony's stepping away from Quantic Dream because of, the recent allegations of a poor work environment, and they just don't want to deal with that anymore. Or maybe they didn't offer enough money to Quantic Dream, this, that, and the other. I think this is really a matter of, at some point or another, whether it was before or after the allegations, Sony probably did try to purchase Quantic Dream, but this tells us now more than anything that Quantic Dream said no. If they had this grander vision to not just be a developer, but also a publisher, and work with multiple different studios, and, just do different genres, which we all know they're very well known for that, AAA storytelling experience. I mean, it seems quite obvious that this was really on the cards for them for a long time now. So that really tells you that whether Sony did or didn't want to work with them, I don't think Quantic Dream was really up for being purchased to begin with. With all that said, though, I don't think we'll be following them too much now in Let's Talk PlayStation, because as you know, we focus very heavy PlayStation-related stories, and they just recently left PlayStation, so that's why it's still pretty relevant. But it seems like they're, just going into a different direction. So unless Sony partners up with them again, or they do something with a Sony-owned IP, which is, well, Quantic Dream's games right now, Heavy Rain, Beyond, Detroit, those are still Sony properties, and Sony's allowing them to go to PC. We'll talk about them in that sense whenever that comes up. So not only are we getting the new PS Plus games on August 6th, but apparently we're also getting some tournaments on PlayStation 4, so this is pretty cool, and I almost feel like they've done this before. Like, I'm pretty sure they did something like this 2-3 years ago. I vaguely remember it. Somebody can remind me, but either way, they're doing this again, which is that, on the events tab, you can now join some tournaments that will be worldwide. So you've got to be a PS Plus member, but they'll be doing it for like Mortal Kombat and I believe Battlefield and a few other games that were announced on the PlayStation blog. But this is a thing where, you can, compete in a bunch of qualifying games, and if you reach a certain threshold, you can get a free theme. If you reach a higher threshold, you could possibly get some in-game currency or even actual cash prizes. So that's cool. I think this is a great initiative. I quite honestly don't remember much of the previous tournaments that whatever Sony did, because I just wasn't really into that thing. But this is a pretty community-driven thing that I think Sony should be involved in. I think this is something that they should have been heavily investing in if they haven't been already. It doesn't seem like they have, because I haven't really heard anything about it recently within the last how many years from when we originally had this news story. So I don't know what's really going on, but I think it's a great idea. So keep your eyes peeled for that if you're really into the competitive scene with a lot of these games. Now, let's finally get on the Chinese import tariff story. Not a very good update, it looks like. So Sony's actually commented on this recently. So the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Sony's financial director, Hiroki Tsutoki, is actually warning PlayStation customers, more or less saying that if this goes through, there may be a scenario where the 25% increase on these, electronics coming into the U.S. could be passed down to the consumer, which is unfortunate. And now Sony also warned to the administration that, this is very damaging to the U.S. economy. They did have a joint letter with Nintendo and Microsoft as well, basically warning that this affects retailers, consumers, game developers, big studios. I mean, this is a very big deal that shouldn't be taken lightly. Please dial back on the 25%. It's just too much. It's just going to affect the end consumer. And now Sony's in a position where I guess this is the very start of them putting it out there that if this potentially happens, this is an avenue we're exploring. They didn't say it's for sure. They didn't say it's absolutely going to happen, but it's something that they are considering where some sort of cost will have to be passed down. So as it looks right now, I don't think Sony's really in a position to be lowering the price of PlayStation 4 if they're gearing up for any new PS4 hardware, like I mentioned earlier, like a possible refresh of the PS4 Slim or PS4 Pro. PS4 Pro is certainly due for a price cut. It's 2-year-old hardware now. They've got a pretty good margin on there. They can certainly afford to do a price cut that's not necessarily a retailer price cut, but an MSRP cut. But I think that might be off the cards for now. I don't really think those machines are up for getting a price increase, but I think this could dramatically, influence the PlayStation 5 price, because I think a lot of us are expecting it to be in the $499 range. It seems like a lot of us are really expecting it to be that. So let's in theory say it's $499. It's not going to be $499 anymore, especially for a new hardware launch. That's what's so important about this moment right now, which is that during a hardware launch, the margins are incredibly low for brand new consoles. I mean, to the point where usually console manufacturers take a loss. Now, that wasn't the case with Sony this generation. They earned a profit on PS4 hardware immediately, but usually they take a loss. Now, I don't know where their projections are with PlayStation 5 right now. I don't know if they're in a situation where, given Mark Cerny's comments saying that I think it'll be a favorable price given the specs that we have, the specs that we hear right now do seem incredibly impressive. Now, we don't have exact specs, so it's still give or take a lot of money. It's especially because this is also high volume prices when it comes to Sony purchasing this stuff, right? So a lot of people always look at this stuff and go, oh, there's no way Sony can squeeze that stuff into the PS5 for $500, but people just seem to leave out the fact that consoles have the benefit of mass bulk purchasing and deals with the supplier, which is AMD. So this is just a lot more substantial. This could definitely change. If they're targeting $499 now, and this goes through, there's no way I think it would be a very dramatic situation where Sony's going to have to seriously consider bumping it up at least $50, maybe even a little bit more. And that's a real big danger zone with the console being really unfavorable to consumers, because that's a really high price tag that puts a lot of people off, and it's understandable. But this is like the worst timing for something like this, a brand new hardware launch, definitely. And I think Sony is real worried. I think Microsoft's also pretty worried. That's the thing, is this incident's not isolated to Microsoft. It's going to affect Nintendo. It's going to affect Microsoft as well, and they're dealing with it in their own ways. They haven't said anything so far. There was a rumor that they're considering, moving manufacturing outside of China. It's a very real possibility, and I think that's one of the avenues that Sony's exploring right now. There's not much else we can say right now because there's so many unknowns, but I think new hardware is the biggest threat right now to this potential 25% increase of these goods coming into the US. But anyway, let's get to Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you could win a $10 PSN code, and I'd like to congratulate this wonderful individual. I tried practicing your name. I don't want to offend you if I get it wrong, so I'm just not going to try it. But you have won a $10 PSN code. You know who you are. I'll be contacting you very soon via Twitter or email. If you would like to win a $10 PSN code, very simple. Follow that link down below. We do this every single week. Supporting this channel in a number of ways can gain you an entry, and the winner will be announced next week. Those are all the news stories I want to talk about with you all. So our Monday and Wednesday video was PlayStation Vita, why I liked it more than the PlayStation Portable, and also some trophies that I didn't want to complete and I didn't want to go for the Platinum. So we do a lot of trophy stories here. Go watch that one. That's the one of my failures where I just said, I'm not gonna do those anymore. And it's so weird. I want to say Tuesday video, but now we're doing 2 videos a week. And so I hope you enjoy that. So it's obviously, we get to do a little bit more on the channel now, which is good. We can experiment a little bit. And speaking of which, do you guys want an EA Access review next week? I've had a few people ask me to review EA Access, which I find interesting because if you look at any EA Access content on YouTube, it's people saying, I hate you, EA, with a fiery passion. And so I don't feel like it even makes a whole lot of sense to review EA Access when it's just going to be a video nobody likes. But if you want me to actually fairly review the service, let me know, and I might consider doing it. Otherwise, we will just do some other, random topics for Monday and Wednesday, which I won't tell you about, but we got some very interesting stuff coming in the pipeline, a lot of stuff covering PlayStation history. We got more trophy stories for sure. We got more regular, deep dives into some hardware. I've also got a few things I'm doing where it's really weird and you wouldn't expect it. Kind of like the PS4 Pro grill video, if you remember that one. Lots of stuff we got going on here, so I hope you enjoy it. And as always, thank you so much for watching. So, that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.